I was getting ready to come. It didn't even hit me literally until this morning. Um, so I think I'm going to call a little bit of an audible here because this is the first Sunday of the quarter. But Johnny being out of town, his class is actually going to start in 2 weeks because Lord willing, next week will be the beginning of our gospel meeting. So that means a lot of folks that are planning to be in that class are going to be in here this morning. And so I thought I was planning to start my study, which is going to be Hebrew history. We left off in the middle of the book of Kings, right where the kingdom divides. And so I want to pick up there. I like to do that. I like to do this study because when Johnny has a class going on, because I know not everybody is a big fan of history. Some people view that, well, that's not as interesting to me or whatever. And so having another class gives folks an option if they'd rather go and study through that booklet that Johnny's going to teach. But that leaves us with this Sunday. So I think what I'm going to do, as I said, is kind of audible here. I grabbed these booklets. We finished the booklet 3 of the personal evangelism study, Back to the Bible. But I want to, basically, I want to see, are there any questions or comments, observations, anything that you might have, and I then we'll, if not, and maybe even if so, we should have time. I want to go back and look at the last page because, as I mentioned last week, you don't want to just end up in a situation where somebody obeys the gospel without any kind of mention of now that you're a Christian or once you become a Christian. So I want to just touch on that. I may mention one other thing if I have time. If we still have time left, then we'll kind of summarize where we were up to the point where we left off last in Hebrew history, and just get a sort of a summation of the history of the Israelites up to that point. And that won't get us too in depth for anybody that might be going in 2 weeks to Johnny's class. Just like I said, it kind of I don't want to start new material with some folks that are going to be, I know, are planning already to go to that class. So, with that said, anything as far as questions? I know we kind of had to wrap up quickly last week, anyways, because time always, as it always seems to do, gets away. Questions or anything from the personal evangelism study? It may just be an observation. It may be an experience from having conducted a study, or maybe you sat in on a study. Yes, sir.
This may sound like a dumb question, but how do we get people into studies? How do we get a study started?
How do you get the study started? That is, it's a good question. It's a great question because that a lot of times is the most difficult part. Once you get into the study, especially if you have material, even folks that say, "Oh, I don't really know that much" or whatever. If you got material, you can use that and conduct the study. It's getting into the study. I'm not by any stretch an expert on that, but I've watched and seen and learned some from people. There are people that are obviously better at it than others because some people are they're more personable, and then there are people who are they're very, what's the word I'm looking for? Courageous, bold. One of the biggest things, what is one of the biggest fears of any individual? It's rejection. It's why a lot of times the guy never asked the girl out. And, sometimes you talk to people that they got together finally and they said, well, we liked each other for like 6 months. He never would ask me out. Well, I was afraid she was going to say no. It happens all the time. Nobody likes rejection, right? And so if you want to have a study with someone and you want to go and ask them for a study, we're always so afraid that somebody's going to say no. And so one of the things that makes some folks so good at that is there are folks that, we all knew that guy, or maybe even a girl. That guy, he'd go up to somebody and you say, man, she's out of his league. He wasn't scared, man. He'd just go right up and ask, right? There's just some people that they got a little more boldness to them. Even with, studying the Bible with folks, there's a certain element of that makes some folks better. But then there are folks that are deathly afraid of rejection, but yet they can still get into Bible studies. I love what Rob Whitaker says all the time. I don't remember hearing him say this until this most recent meeting he held with us, but I don't think we can overemphasize it. You have to earn the right. You have to earn the right to a study. That's not complicated. Sometimes we say that and we go, oh, wow, what does that mean? That sounds like a lot of hard work. It's not. It just means being nice, being a Christian, being kind, being compassionate, but you got to earn the right. And what sometimes will happen, I mentioned to you in the very beginning of that personal evangelism study that the brother in Childersburg who, I kind of told him, here's a lady that's been visiting some. That would be a good potential Bible study. And so he just walks right up to her. He had seen her coming to church, but he didn't know her. And he just walks up and he says, hey, would you like to have a Bible study with me? And the lady just looked terrified, and she said she couldn't even answer. She just shook her head no. And so I said, let's try a different approach. And so we go over there, and, we talked about how we had helped her, the church had helped her benevolently. She needed some food. And so we'd helped give her some food and done other things for her to try to help out. You could sometimes see this lady that her and her dad, they would walk all over town. Sometimes they'd walk down to the Coosa River, and you could see them walking down the road with a fishing pole in hand and a bucket. And sometimes that means, or it always meant they were going fishing. Sometimes they caught something, sometimes they didn't. So we helped them out, and so we go over there and we talk to them. We say, I'm glad that we made that connection with you and that you've been coming and visiting with us. And are you liking it here? Are the people being nice? Oh yeah, friendly people. We just love coming here. And I said, well, it'd be nice. We would love to sit down and study the Bible with you sometime. If there's a good time for you, what would be a good time? Well, any time really. And it's just a complete different answer because of the approach. And so I like that terminology. You have to earn the right for a study. And I know of another situation where it was somebody who was already a Christian, but a couple, I believe this also happened at Childersburg. No, it wasn't Childersburg, it was somewhere else. But there was a couple that they were members of the church, members of the body of Christ, but they came to visit a congregation. I think they were new to the community. They came to visit, and one of the members approached them, well-intentioned brother, but he approached them and he said, hey, it's good to have y'all visiting, and he talks to them a little bit and finds out they're members of the church, and he says, well, listen, we're having directory pictures, so you need to sign up for a slot. And you could just see kind of like, whoa, we're visiting, and we're just kind of checking congregations out or whatever. And it was so, and sometimes we do that, right? Sometimes we dive right in without earning that right. And so it might be a benevolent act. It might be, what was the term that Rob used with the cards? Card bombing. Wasn't that it? Is that right? And I think we've started some of that with sending cards and stuff, and that means a lot. Sister Anita was telling me that her brother said just, I think it was last week, it was telling her, said he went to the mailbox one day and had 4 cards just from members at the Bremen congregation. The congregation up there in Kentucky has been sending cards, and they've been sending people out there. And so, these are things that you can do that kind of open a door. House to house, heart to heart is a fantastic door opener. And in fact, Rob did a whole session at PTP this last time where he talked about using house to house to develop contacts. And one of the things that people will say, I worked with a congregation several years ago, and the statement was made, we did house to house for a year. We didn't get any results from it, so we stopped. People say that a lot. Listen, house to house, heart to heart is not a publication to go out and convert your community. It's opening doors so you can get into a study with someone. People obey the gospel when they study. People don't just, at least 9 times out of 10. There have been a few occasions where somebody just sits down and reads, but 9 times out of 10, people aren't going to get a publication like that, read it, and go, oh, wow, okay. I'm doing I've been having some wrong beliefs, doing things wrong. I need to make some changes here. You got to get into a study, because sometimes there are things that we're going to disagree on. That's the elephant in the room in the religious world that nobody wants to talk about. Sometimes you have different denominations. They say, well, you just go to the church of your choice. So you think I should be over here? Well, no, I don't think you should be over there because I disagree with some things. So churches, they're all not the same. Well, yeah, they're all the same. I mean, everybody's going to heaven by different roads. So I could just go over here and you're okay with that. Well, no, I couldn't be okay with that because and you see, people talk out of both sides of their mouth. The elephant in the room is there are differences. Why are there differences? And what is the answer? And the answer is to go back to the Bible. And that's all we're trying to do here. But I need to get into that study. And so, I can use something like house to house to help open a door. And somebody says, I can't tell how many times, even just since 7 years of being at Bremen, you knock on somebody's door. Maybe we're getting just out inviting people to the gospel meeting or something. They say, Bremen, where is that? And I say, well, it's over there kind of almost across the street from Hardy's. And sometimes I always try to take a house-to-house, heart-to-heart with me and say, you may recognize this. Oh, yeah, boy, I like that. So many people. Rob told of I can't remember what the denomination was, but he said he was out door knocking recently and mentioned the house-to-house, heart-to-heart, and the person who was knocking on the door, they were a member of some denomination. They said, oh, yeah, we love that. So I take it all. I'm church secretary. I take it all the time. We run it in our bulletin. So, but, you're opening doors. It's not going to go and just convert people in and of itself most of the time. But you use something like that, cards, house-to-house, benevolence. You can have, it may be friends, it may be family. You can have them over. And Rob talks about how he likes to get his whole family involved. Sometimes the children will make desserts. Hannah likes to make desserts, and Nicole likes to cook supper for them. And you get over there, and it's not just a cold call at that point, right? And so, even when I'm out door knocking, I try to, if I'm at the door, I try to talk to somebody. There's always something that you can find to talk to someone about. So it's not just, hello, I'm from the Bremen Church of Christ. We want to invite you to our meeting. Oh, by the way, would you like a Bible study? You're almost never going to get a yes from that. But if you start saying, hey, sometimes I'll notice toys. So it looks like you got some children. And somebody may say, oh, those are my grandchildren. I say, oh, man, I know you grandparents, you love those grandbabies, right? And you say, you mentioned grandbabies. You're in a conversation if somebody has grandchildren, right? I mean, those of you that have grandchildren, that's all you got to say, right? And that you're at ease and you're talking. And maybe sometimes I even just say, if it's somebody who's a little bit stubborn, if you're having any trouble, you know what you can say? Oh, do you have any pictures? Do you have pictures of those grandbabies? Man, now you're in. So, maybe it may be their own children. So, yeah, I've got 2 children. And say, well, we got 7. That automatically gets somebody, what? 7? And so, but it's opening a door and we can start talking. And when you start talking, then people get more at ease and you can get into that study. But, again, I'm no expert, but a lot of times it's just a matter of establishing some kind of rapport, some kind of relationship, and kind of earning that right to say, hey, would you like to have a study? Or let's sit down sometime and talk about that. And a lot of times I think another hindrance sometimes to the study is this illustration is not original to me. I heard it used by one of the Fishers of Men instructors. But he talks about how when you're young, Mom is cooking supper, and you come in and you say, what do we got to eat? Are we having chips in here? Well, what's Mama say when she's cooking supper? And you come in there asking for chips and Little Debbie's and whatever it might be. You're not getting that. I'm cooking supper. You're going to ruin your dinner. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that growing up, right? So what does Mom do? Well, a lot of times, at least my mom, she gave you something to do. In fact, one of the worst things you could ever say to Joyce Dollahite when I was growing up was, I'm bored. And she said, well, if you're bored, you need something to do. And I can find you something to do. But sometimes you say, I want to get some chips. No, you're not getting any chips. I'm cooking supper. But I'm so hungry. Well, here, set the table. Or something needs to be done before supper. Go take care of that. And what she's doing is she's kind of occupying until what time? Till the food is laid out, supper's ready. And what we're doing sometimes is people come to us with a question, and it's an I'm hungry question. I'm spiritually hungry, and we're throwing the Little Debbies out. We're throwing the chips and the pretzels and whatever out there, and they're snacking, and they get a bait of that, and when it comes time for supper, which would be the study, guess what? They're just not interested. They've been snacking. And you know, it's not a perfect illustration, but it's kind of, I see what he's saying with that, because what will happen sometimes is somebody says, well, why don't y'all use instruments? And as he puts it, his brother had a saying he would say all the time. He'd say, you know, somebody asks this question, and what do we do? And, you know, he'd say, we answer it, right? Because I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and I know stuff. And so somebody says, why don't you use instruments? And so I may just throw out a quick answer for that, or may even try to give a longer answer. Somebody says, do y'all believe over there where you attend that a person has to be baptized to be saved? And you know what? A lot of times, well, yeah. Why do you believe that? Well, let me just tell you. And we start maybe even throwing out verses. And, you know, again, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. But how much, you know, sometimes you get, and sometimes it's even, this happened to me when I was just a teenager. I got a job working at Walmart, and I had a coworker. One night we were talking, and we get into a discussion, and I was just getting a smattering of Bible knowledge at that point, and I felt like, you know, I was kind of disagreeing with him on some stuff, very Calvinistic stuff. He believed babies were sinners and all this, and so I started talking to him about that, and you know what happened was we got right in the midst of that, and I felt like I was getting ready to really get some powerful arguments, and the boss lady came along. She says, hey, what y'all doing? Don't y'all need to be getting back to work? Oh, yeah, we did. And so right in the middle of it, just got completely interrupted. If I could do it over again, I'd say, you know, I'd like to study that a little bit further. Could you and I sit down at some time and talk about this and see what does the Bible say about that? Because I've never believed that. I've never been taught that babies are born in sin. I've heard of it, but I've never really studied that out. And, you know, if it's what the Bible teaches, I want to follow it. So let's sit down with an open Bible and let's talk about that. That's what I'd do if I had to do over again. And to this day, when somebody says to me, hey, Chad, why don't y'all use a piano down there at the Bremen Church of Christ? I say, well, you know, that's a great question. And it's you know, there's a short answer and there's a longer answer. But really, I would like to do that question justice. Could we sit down sometime and I'll just open the Bible and we'll talk about it? And what do y'all teach about baptism down there at the Bremen Church of Christ? Well, listen, we're just trying to follow the Bible. There's a lot more to salvation than just baptism. If you're willing, I'd love to sit down and let's just open the Bible and I'll show you. Because we don't have any kind of creed, we don't have any kind of doctrine. We're just trying to follow the Bible. You know, it's kind of putting off. And I mentioned this several times going through the booklets. Sometimes people ask a question, and I'm not trying to ignore a question. It's just something that we'll deal with later on. And so instead of giving the snack, I say, just hold on. We're going to come to that. And sometimes when you do that, most often when you do that, when you get to the meal and you get in that study, you got somebody that's devouring. Now they've come to the table hungry. And so that's another key, I think, that I've missed. I don't know how many studies over the years because I didn't handle that situation as well as I could have. Yes, sir.
Go back to the archives of our spring meeting when Rob was here. He dedicated a large portion of one of the earlier messages, I can't remember which day it was, about how to get into studies and how you, quote unquote, categorize prospects.
Yes.
Hot prospects. Those hot prospects are those that are sitting amongst us, those that come, those that are members, those that are unfaithful, those that have family members that would benefit from a study, but perhaps a family member is uncomfortable trying to get into a study. They won't listen to a family member. They might listen to somebody outside. But you have those hot prospects that are ones that we should try to pay attention to, not ignore.
Right.
Figure that somebody
Yeah, and that if you go to the archives, it was this most recent meeting that Rob actually, there was a session where he talks a lot about getting those studies. And in that booklet, I think there's one more left out here. I need to put some more out here because we still got plenty left. But the workbook, the spiral bound workbook, there's a section in there on contacts. And, as Chris was saying, Rob calls them hot contacts. These are people that many times they're already attending. And every congregation has folks that are attending that they've never obeyed the gospel. And sometimes it's one of those deals, as Chris said, everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it or should do it, and they just never get into that study. That's a hot contact. I mean, they're there, they're showing interest, and so, you want to try to get into a study with that person. And some of this is even similar to some business. Business talks about cold contacts, with sales. And you cold contact people, and you understand when you're cold contacting potential customers, you're not going to have as much success. You're not going to have as much reception. The same thing, door knocking is like that. It's not as likely that you're going to end up in a study. Sometimes with door knocking, in fact, I've even heard of congregations that would do what they call door hangings. And they would have a little like clear packets and they got the doorknob hanger and just go and hand those out. And what that is that's it's a lot like house to house, heart to heart. It's saying, we're here, we're in the community, and we're, to use a business term, we're open for business. We're just letting people know we're concerned about you and we want to invite folks and we want folks to know. And you couple that with other efforts. And that's sort of how door knocking often is. But Miss Rachel, your door was knocked on, and that's how that came to be. So sometimes people say, well, door knocking doesn't work. It's not going to be as effective as someone you know personally and you get into a study, or somebody who's already attending and you get into a study. But it is. It's part of it. And to say it doesn't work is just not true.
This coming Saturday, speaking of door knocking,
Yeah.
perfect opportunity. This coming Saturday, be here 9 o'clock, and we'll fan out and go.
Yeah, this Saturday, 9 o'clock, we'll do our door knocking that we do before every gospel meeting. And that was, I don't know, was it 2 years ago, Miss Rachel, that we knocked on your door, and, you never know. And that was, you get into a conversation, friend of a friend of a friend, and next thing you know, somebody visits, studies, and obeys the gospel. So perfect opportunity to put some of these things into real life practice this coming Saturday. But yeah, there's some really good material in Rob's lesson from the meeting, but also in that booklet. There's a whole section on different, whether it's, as he calls it, a hot contact, or developing a contact from another source. Very, very good material. Anything else as far as any of that goes? Look at, if you have the red booklet. If you don't worry about it. I don't have the extra copies with me. Like I said, I kind of audibled this morning. We do still have plenty of those. I put them up in the elder's office. But I just mainly wanted to mention, because I had to move quickly through it last week, the counting the cost page. You've gone through several things, and we didn't even go through every single verse last week because we ran out of time. But he talks about when's the accepted time, when is the day of salvation. These are just further attempts to get somebody. If here's a person who has the knowledge, but they're not committing. The person is not saying, well, yes, let's stop right here. I need to go. I need to obey the gospel. You're just bringing up points. I don't want you to be lost. There are verses in here that talk about the torment of hell, and nobody wants that. I don't want that for my worst enemy, let alone somebody that I've come to know and love and respect during a Bible study. Revelation 20 verse 15 talks about if your name is not in the book of life, you ask the question, is your name in the book of life? Do you want God to write your name in his book of life? Well, we can take care of that. Again, I try to be very careful in that. I'm not trying to say to somebody, hey, come on, let's go. What are you waiting for? I don't want to, if it comes down to that, and and you'll know when you're in the situation, if somebody's really thinking about it and they're on the fence, or if they're just kind of uninterested. if they're uninterested, I don't want to bug them to death till they finally say, whether internally or audibly, where they basically say, he ain't going to leave me alone until I do this. Yeah, sure, whatever, let's go. Because that's just somebody getting dunked. That's no good. So I want to be careful that I'm not trying to pressure them, but at the same time, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 11, I believe it is, 11 or 12, Paul says, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. And so unless I see that it's somebody's just not interested, sometimes I am going to, hey, come on, because sometimes there is something holding folks back. Sometimes people break down. This happened very first foreign mission trip I ever took. A lady she was right there. She had the knowledge. She wasn't doing it. Like, what is going on? What is holding you back? And finally she breaks down and she confesses, I'm living with a man. We're not married. I said, oh, yeah, that's something that has to be taken care of. And so we worked to help take care of that. And she did end up obeying the gospel, but I could tell she was sincere. I could tell she wanted to, but something was holding her back. So that's what a lot of these are. But when you get to the last page there are several verses that talk about this idea of counting the cost. Hebrews 5:9. Well, let me just get readers. Hebrews 5:9. Revelation 2:10. All right, Martin. Matthew 6:33. Caleb. And Hebrews 10:25. All right, Brother Tim.
And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him.
All right, so being made perfect, Jesus, being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. So the question is, must we obey Jesus to be saved eternally? Obviously, yes. Will you obey him is the next question. Well, that's a question that needs to be asked. Somebody may say, hey, I'm ready. I want to be baptized into Christ. I want to have my sins washed away. I want to be a new creature, 2 Corinthians 5:17. Okay. Are you willing to obey him? I mean, not just today, but every day. What about when you go back to work on Monday? What about when you go back to work tomorrow? This may be a weeknight. When you go into work tomorrow, you going to obey? Because it's not always going to be easy. What about 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road? Revelation 2:10. Who had that one?
Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to thrust some of you in prison, you will have tribulation for grace. Be faithful to death, and I will give you the crown of life.
All right, so be faithful unto death. I will give thee a crown of life. The question here is, must we follow Jesus faithfully to be saved eternally? Obviously, yes. And this is maybe one of those where you need one of the charts in the workbook or something, because somebody may say, oh, no. Once you're saved, you're always saved. There may be misunderstanding on that, so you may have to unpack that a little further and study it. And sometimes people think that. I mean, I've had situations where I had no idea. But, buddy, here's a person, they obeyed the gospel, and then just, they're gone. They're in the wind. Where are they? Can't get them to come to church. I sometimes have a hard time even get a hold of them. And they either didn't understand or didn't care. Maybe they didn't truly commit, or maybe they didn't understand the commitment. I sometimes try to give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just didn't understand. Matthew 6:33. Seek ye first, First. We know what that word means. The kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Must we put God first in our lives? Obviously, yes. And so I ask people right here, will you promise to put God first in your life? Are you going to commit to doing that from now on? God comes first. I think too many times people don't give that a second thought when they're becoming Christians. Yes, sir?
From my experience in life, Christianity is not a certificate religion. You don't get to a point where you get a certificate and all those verses say Christianity is a seeking religion. And if we're not actively seeking God,
Yeah, and I think that's a good statement. It's not a certificate religion; it's a seeking religion, and that's interesting because the text Chris read this morning is obviously the text for our Sunday morning sermon in just a little bit, and that was the Jews' problem. They kind of viewed it as a certificate. We're God's people. Look, we got our certificate. We're God's people, and they thought they could just go and offer the lame, the blemished. They could just do whatever. They were not seeking God. And if we ever stop seeking God, I mean, spoiler alert, that's kind of the end of the sermon, is that, that's the antidote for worthless worship, is you got to seek God, and you seek Him on His terms. But that's a good way of putting it. Christianity is a seeking religion. Hebrews 10:25. So the question here is, must Christians be faithful in attendance? Yes, obviously. Will you be faithful in attending the services of the Lord's church? After you are baptized into Christ, where do you plan to worship? Sometimes that question has an obvious answer, and we know they're going to be here. Sometimes it's a situation where they're going to be somewhere else. Maybe they're moving, or maybe they're not from here. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I have, in recent years, I don't say it ugly, I don't say it disrespectfully, but sometimes I will talk to people. If I get to a point where somebody wants to obey the gospel and we go through a few verses like this, maybe even other verses, I've had a couple times recently where I think Miss Holly and I had this discussion where I say to people, look, in the last several years, I have seen a lot of people, even that I studied with, obey the gospel, and they just fall away. And so I'm thrilled that you want to obey the gospel. But I want you to understand, and I would rather you just not go through with this than to do this and then you just fall right away and back into the world, or not put God first, or whatever. And I just, I've laid that out a couple times in recent months to folks, just because I want them to understand. So often, people, even in spite of my efforts, on other occasions, without just coming out and saying it, people would just obey the gospel and they just kind of quit. And sometimes there are other things involved in that, but sometimes it's just a mentality of, as Bob put it, certificate. I got my certificate. And that's not, we got to be seeking God. And part of that is being present and being at worship, and being at Bible study, and being involved, and being part of a family, a spiritual family. And so sometimes people just miss that. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding. Sometimes there's a heart problem that develops. But if somebody's ready to obey the gospel, it's more often than not, it's a misunderstanding. And so I just try to make sure folks understand that in no uncertain terms, because it does no good for somebody just to obey the gospel and then fall away. It is, and that, incorporate them into the spiritual family. Right. Yeah, can you imagine a physical family where, new baby's born, you bring them home and kind of set that baby over in the corner, and mom and dad don't ever spend time with that baby. They'll give it the food that's required to keep it alive, but, it's kind of over here. We got our own little group, and we can't be bothered with this new baby. And, that child grows up, you don't need me to tell you what the result of that's going to be. It's not good. So you got to, incorporate people into the family of God. Yes, sir.
We had a family at Carrollton years ago, John and Myrtle White. Some of you may remember John. He was in charge of the hospital cleaning services.
Mm-hmm.
Just a fine gentleman. Myrtle was, without a doubt, the best Bible teacher I have ever encountered in going out and setting up studies. And she would make a commitment. She did it on 9 different occasions that I can remember well. When the person she'd been studying with was baptized, she committed 12 months to them. She visited them once a week for 12 months.
That's amazing.
And there was almost no falling away if Myrtle taught them. It just blew my mind.
That is, and that's key, because you have to be incorporated into the body. If you don't, if you don't develop relationships, I heard an illustration years ago about a guy who obeyed the gospel, and within just a very short period of time, a few months maybe, he was back at the bowling alley with his drinking buddies and stuff because they accepted him. They came up to him. They talked to him. They invited him to go out with them and do stuff. And what was happening was in the spiritual family, that just wasn't happening. And there was sometimes we need to keep, I think it was PTP this year. I think it was Rob. Somebody put the quote on the Facebook PTP page, but I think it was Rob that made the statement, every congregation should have a new converts class going on. And he says, like, all the time. And he says, you know, even if you don't have any, quote, new converts, keep that teaching going on and keep, you know, the newest Christians. They may not be, quote, new. Of course, how do you define what is a new Christian? They may not be the newest of Christians, but just keep that going and keep teaching. And you know, especially in that smaller setting, people tend to be more open. They talk more. They discuss more. And that's helpful all around. Yes, sir, Bob?
I'd like to have a personal evangelism class. Not to teach us, because we've been taught to death on it,
Yeah.
but the doing part. So a class where everybody in there commits themselves to doing personal evangelism, and then we just keep talking about how to get better and better at it.
Yeah. Fishers of men, they did that. That was part of our assignment was you had to go out and get studies. I thought, what am I going to do? And so I went, and finally, it was like the day before it was due, I had to ask somebody for a study. So I went and I asked, and you know what? They said yes. Got in a study with an unfaithful brother who ended up being restored. And it was just, you know, it's amazing what happens sometimes when we just ask. Ask, and you shall receive. I mean, you know, Jesus tells us, you ask, you'll receive. You seek, you'll find. Ran out of time here. Stephanie sent me a text that mentioned something that, you know, this is also important. Remember, there are 4 types of soil. Jesus talks about this in the parable of the sower. 4 different types of soil. And, you know, 3 out of 4, they fell away. Or it never took root, and they never obeyed the gospel in the first, the hard ground. The stony ground, thorny soil, you know, it took root, but in a short time fell away. There's only one that brought forth fruit. Now, that's not meant to give us an exact formula that you can go out and you can expect only 25% of people, because there will be times, and even with congregations, you'll see where they have a good year, or maybe as a personal evangelist, you may have a streak where you know, it feels like everybody I'm studying with lately obeys the gospel. And then you may hit a streak later on, you feel like nobody is obeying the gospel. I'm asking people right and left, nobody wants to study. And then you may have an explosion of studies. So it's not always going to be exactly 25%, but what it does let us know is that, what did Jesus say? Straight is the gate, narrow is the way that leads to life, and few there be that find it. Strive to enter in at the straight gate. We've got to teach. We've got to ask for those studies. And, you know, Miss Tammy made a great observation. Once they become a Christian, part of that responsibility is on us to bring them into the family and to keep teaching, keep encouraging, and help them to stay faithful. Thank you very much for your time. Next week, man, gospel meetings upon us. That'll be next week. And then on the 15th, Johnny's class will start in the fellowship hall, and we'll begin looking at 1 Kings chapter 12 in here. Thank you.